Hi. So Brent Swallow again, AREC 173, Plate, Planet, and Society. This is the second lecture for the week of October 26th to 30th. So we're going to continue the theme and wrap up the theme on agriculture environment interactions and sustainable agriculture with a focus on water and specifically water quality. So I'm going to share my screen and get us kicked off. Okay, so this is we're going to focus on kind of the problem of agriculture water quality interactions in a couple areas of the world, then including Canada. Then we're going to look at sort of contextualize the problem sort of in more general terms. And what does it mean for things like rights, how we frame the problem, and then look at how some policy options for dealing with the problem that kind of focus on people's incentives and farmers' incentives. So this is the outline. We're going to talk about the Lake Winnipeg watershed in Canada, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, but touch upon issues in China. And then what are these options and motives? And we'll have the particular case of wetlands in Alberta to have a discussion about two market-based instruments for dealing with non-point source pollution, water pollution associated with agriculture relative to wetlands, mitigation banking and conservation auctions. So here we go. Just a reminder, I showed this slide earlier in the class in terms of water quantity. Agriculture is a large use of water. Irrigated agriculture it covers about 20% of all of the agriculture area in the world is irrigated, and that 20% of the area produces 40% of the food. So water as an input into agriculture is very, very important, especially in irrigation systems. 70% of the fresh water that we capture is used for agriculture. So of all the water that we use as humans, 70% of what we use is for agriculture. When we look at it, there actually are other sources of water. Water scarcity varies a lot from place to place. I've decided to focus not so much on water scarcity and instruments for dealing with water scarcity, but water quality and instruments for dealing with water quality in this year's lecture. I think it's a richer set of things that we can learn and very, very important. I showed the top two photos before about water quality agriculture interactions. So we have two locations in China, in Yunnan province in southern China, in the Dianchi Lake, in the lake, and then a plume of sediment extending into the East China Sea in China from the Changjiang River. On the bottom left-hand corner, I have an example from the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So this is a large plume of sediment that is associated with a seasonal flood or high rainfall and flood situation in Australia. This sediment is carrying lots of nitrogen and phosphorus, primarily from farmers' fields in the catchment area of the Great Barrier Reef. And we'll get back to the Great Barrier Reef story in a few minutes. I wanted to start with this story from Canada. The second largest river basin in Canada is the Lake Winnipeg watershed, which drains all the way from the British Columbia border to the far west, through Alberta, through Saskatchewan, through parts of Manitoba to Lake Winnipeg. There also are, so that's the Saskatchewan River system primarily that drains across the prairies into Lake Winnipeg. There also are river basins that drain from Ontario, from Kenora into Lake Winnipeg, as well as the Red River, and another river which drain, the Souris River, which drain through the United States into Lake Winnipeg. There are the numbers there. This is the 10th largest freshwater lake in the world. The second largest watershed in Canada, with the Mackenzie Basin, which drains into the Arctic, being somewhat larger. And this is an interesting watershed because it's shared between two countries, Canada and the US, and 4 provinces within Canada and 4 states in the United States. We have a picture of Lake Winnipeg is well known for fishing, and particularly ice fishing. So here's a proud ice fisher with his walleye catch. But the fisheries and other resources of Lake Winnipeg are threatened by the large inflows of nutrients, especially nitrogen, phosphorus, from agricultural areas within the basin, leading to eutrophication of the water system. And here we have an evidence of that, which is this blue-green algae, which is washed up onto the shore on the upper right-hand photograph. And then in the lower panel, you see evidence from a satellite imagery, interpreted satellite imagery of a large plume of nutrients extending into Lake Winnipeg from that river. So the bright green is, again, algae, which is on the surface of the lake. The Lake Winnipeg Basin has a number of what we call point sources and non-point sources. So these are the point sources of pollution. So we have things like just downstream from Edmonton in the North Saskatchewan watershed, we have things like this Imperial Oil Refinery, which is built right up to the edge of the river, as well as the lower left-hand corner. You see the North Saskatchewan River being built right next to, or we see the EPCOR water treatment facility being built right next to the North Saskatchewan River. So this is the Gold Bar facility that many of you may have ran at or cross-country skied at. So those are what we saw, the sorts of industrial and urban sources of pollution we call point sources. We know where they're coming from. In some ways, they can be easier to deal with because they can be well handled sometimes by engineering type solutions, as we talked about during the exam. Agriculture is a main source of non-point source pollution. So pollution which we're a little bit unclear of the magnitude of any particular area, but in totality and kind of cumulative effect, there's a large impact. One of the sources of pollution associated with agriculture is neonicotinoid insecticides, and that green seed there is a seed treatment which is used, and that's corn seed, but you treat the seed with a neonicotinoid insecticide, and as the crop is growing, it was able to kind of fend off any fungi which may attack the seeds, and is that runoff extra use of neonicotinoid insecticide, both as seed coats as well as sprayed on fields, has run off into things like the wetlands that is on Don Rizicus Sunrise Farm in the right-hand corner there. And most of the wetlands throughout the prairies have now been contaminated by this neonicotinoid insecticides. There are moves to ban neonicotinoid insecticides, but not yet in Alberta. So in most of Europe, they're banned, and there are seasonal bans in Australia, in Ontario and Quebec, or some bans in Ontario, restricted bans in Ontario and Quebec, and no particular ban here in Alberta. See, on the southern part of the South Saskatchewan watershed, which joins North Saskatchewan and Prince Albert to form the Saskatchewan draining into Lake Winnipeg, you see a situation where a crop is grown in the kind of the Alberta foothills, which is part of the catchment area, and that crop is being grown instead of it being used for natural grassland. And you can see, as we've talked about before, some of the biodiversity benefits of natural grassland. So this is a pretty highly contested watershed in general, with alternative uses, including different types of agriculture, the resource sectors, urban areas, and nature conservation. Kind of switch over here to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So you can see the overall map of Australia in the little inset there, and the catchment area in green, which drains into several rivers, and then from those rivers is washed out over the Great Barrier Reef. Great Barrier Reef, one of the largest and most beautiful reef systems in the world. And you can see that it is it's under great threat, and we have something here called coral bleaching, which can be seen as sort of the first step toward die-off of the reef. It is one of the land uses there is sugarcane, and there's a great controversy between farmers and scientists of how much of the nutrients and sediments which are being washed out and causing damage to Great Barrier Reef are actually associated with agriculture. So there certainly are deniers, some farmer groups who deny that importance of that runoff. So just to kind of cap it off conceptually then, for both the Lake Winnipeg catchment area and the Great Barrier Reef catchment area of Australia, you could say the same for those catchment areas that I showed you in China. We have multiple sources in the lower basin here is shown as multiple point source pollutants, like the factory and the animal feedlot and the water treatment plant. All of those things are point sources. They can often be dealt with by some type of regulation or penalties for excessive emissions. And then what we're dealing with here with agriculture and other point sources, other non-point sources like rural homes and city streets, are things that are harder to know how important they are and harder to know how to deal with them. Okay, so that ends that mini lecture. So I'm just going to take a pause here, and then we'll come back for the second